Excellent. Let me just go around.
I'm not sure it looks the same.
Oh yeah, good point. I forgot about that. Go for it.
Okay, I guess I'll go. Hi, I'm Dr. Steve Kleinschmidt. I am the director of the Master of Science in Civic Analytics program at the University of Illinois, Chicago. I come with a PhD in public administration, a master's in technology systems, dual undergrad in urban regional planning and applied geography, little Army experience in there, as well as a field artilleryman. Yeah, I guess
applied geography.
Yeah. Good little reverb there, yeah. Our program's been around. We're finishing our second year, and we're going to be graduating our first cohort in the spring. But yeah, I guess I'll be talking more about just civic analytics and what that is in some of the upcoming prompts and whatnot. So I guess I'll hand it over to the next introduction.
And so I guess that leaves me. So I'm Jefferson. I'm the Director for Health Informatics and Technology at the Lake County Health Department and Community Health Center. That's a very long title. Basically, I handle all of the technology aspects of the health department, which is our hardware, software, networks, those sorts of things. I also hold all of our analytics and record keeping, as well as health strategy. So I'm a little mix of everything. As Chris was talking, I was like, yeah, that's sort of, the typical government structure is we put on multiple hats and we just all do everything we can. My background is, I like to say that I'm a classically trained data scientist. My graduate works in epidemiology and biostatistics, so heavy in the healthcare space. I worked for two of the largest healthcare systems, one for pediatrics and the other one here in Chicago. And just really love what analytics can do for our community. And I'm excited to really talk about that and how people can get involved in that.
There we go. Awesome. Sorry, I was on mute for a second there. Really cool. So I love all the intros. I think to kick it off, go back to Stephen. Talk about civic analytics. What is that? What does that mean? How does that differ from everyone else's definition of data analytics at large? That kind of stuff.
Sure. I guess as in the educational landscape goes, the whole field of data science is, in the big scheme of things, relatively new. And of that, public sector data science is very, very new, with even some of the oldest programs only being around since I think like 2013. The very earliest programs and others since 2015. But I guess it all depends on sort of like, there are certain different flavors of public sector data science. You have kind of policy analytics, urban informatics, civic analytics, and I'll speak about that a little bit more. The way that we structured our program is to differentiate ourselves both in terms of emphasis and scale, where many of the programs that started institutions, they took a very strong orientation in towards what I call strategic level policy analytics, that they're very looking at, large scale distributed computing, or they're looking at doing policy analytics for the federal government, or doing large scale population scale estimates and other things like that. We very much have a orientation towards state, regional, and metropolitan government, that the type of students that we're preparing are not going to be working in, say, that's saying that some of them won't opt towards going into the federal government, or won't opt to go into consulting roles, but our program has been created with an emphasis on students that want to serve in state, regional, metropolitan agencies that have an emphasis on the operational data needs of public agencies. So running government, day in, day out, running, transit operations, doing performance dashboards, understanding housing data, using these things for operational needs. So it's a different scale and a different operational emphasis, if you will.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I guess one of my curiosities is kind of, we often talk about, like, I'm sure you see it all over LinkedIn, like the skills you need to become a data scientist or an analyst or whatever. What's missing? Like, usually it's like, learn Python and you'll be good. But to go into like this kind of area, what kinds of things like are, besides those very basic hard skills? I would say, let me take a step back. I have two questions. One, of those hard skills, what's really important and what's kind of a nice to have. And then beyond that, like for people right now who you either connect with or know who are kind of trying to get into that field, what are they missing? What's like the thing that everyone should know that they don't know right now or aren't learning?
Okay, yeah, I guess I'll answer the second question first.
And also everyone can feel free to jump in as well.
Oh, sure, yeah, I'll definitely give a chance here. So, yeah, in doing our due diligence for when creating the degree, we went out and talked to all these sort of partners and different agencies and everything like that. And people were telling us that we learn people that you can teach the hard skills, but it's something about the public sector. It's a very different set of problems that you're dealing with. Human needs. You're dealing often with quantifying and examining psychological phenomena and things that take a social science mindset. So yeah, for us, learning R is our primary environment. I say geospatial methods, GIS is something that's very important. I always say that every public problem has a deterministic spatial component to it, but it's very much that to be in the public sector, and what people have told us is why there's a need for our graduates is that we need people who understand the institutions of government, the mission, particular data structures, everything from census data to zoning, land use map, tax, parcel maps and environmental features and stuff like that. So I think that it's a big thing for our students and just for the field of this developing field of civic analytics is that people understand that you have to have a framework to understand public problems and public institutions and use that to inform your practice of your hard skills, that you can impart a sort of technical set of skills onto a public problem because it simply won't match, and you can't contain it in the same way that you can more project-based initiatives that you might have in the private sector.
That's very.
Yeah, and I think to piggyback off of what Stephen said, as a hiring manager myself and having built the analytics team at the health department, I've always said I can either teach the business or I can teach the technical skills, but I can't teach both at the same time. So you have to really come in with one. I've had people come into the health department with a background in public health or in public policy, and I can teach them how to use R, how to run statistics, how to use Tableau, those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. And I've had people who come in that are statisticians and are really good at the applied mathematics. And then I have to teach them how to do public health and how to deal with all of the government relations and public policy and those sorts of things. So in general, I can teach one or the other, but I can't teach both. And so, when somebody comes in with Python experience, let's say, that's great and wonderful, but there's still going to be a learning curve. And so I think one of the things that I look for when I'm potentially hiring an analyst or a data scientist is an insatiable amount of curiosity, because that's what they're going to need in order to really learn the other components that are going to make them really good at their job. And I think that Stephen said it well, like the problems that we're facing in the public sector are just not the general problems that people are going to get presented with. You're going to go online or even in whatever coursework you do, if you're not in a very specific public program, you're going to be looking and tackling problems, and you're not going to see the types of problems that we look at because they're not the typical data science problems, which I will say is actually really great, because that's an opportunity for people who have this level of insatiable curiosity, that have this idea and just really want to innovate around it. There's a lot of opportunity there. You just really have to have that mindset.
Yeah, no, there's a couple of things you said that I wanted to dive into. One of them, and it's not on the list, but it kind of alludes to something you already ran into. When someone's building an analytics org or a data science org, or however they want to label it, within, kind of like whether it's at a, county department or state run or whatever, what are the kind of common mistakes that you see that get made when someone wants to say, let's do data, let's get better at data? Like, what are some of the issues that people or orgs run into kind of standing that up?
Yeah, I mean, the things that I have both experienced through my own mistakes as well as like this is best way to learn is just do it and fail a couple times and you figure it out, right? Yeah. But also just learning from colleagues, the idea that build it and they will come does not fly in the public sector, because we are, depending on who our audience is, whether it's internal stakeholders or external stakeholders, they are already, I mean, the thing that we have to understand is that government organizations, regardless of what level you're at, we are always strapped for resources, period, end of story. There is not a government entity that I know, or a nonprofit that I know of, that like has the amount of resources that they need to tackle the problems that they have. And that's just because like our problems are enormous and there's a lot of things that we need to do. And so this idea of build it and they will come just doesn't fly, because we have to take this piecewise approach to getting people used to using data, used to using information. Because if you just throw a whole bunch of data out there, or even worse, throw a black box data science model out there, like a neural network or something that nobody understands, then you're really doing no good, because nobody's going to use it, because they're going to all fall back on, because they don't have the time and the resources to learn what you're trying to tell them. Mm-hmm. So you have to, I think that's one of the biggest challenges, and where I see a lot of people go wrong, is you really have to manage change a lot more in a public organization than if you were in a private org, where it's really obvious why you would use data and data science to do what you want to do, because there's a profit line there, right? Yeah. In our world, it's not super obvious. So you have to make those connections for people, and you have to guide them, and the change management is really important.
Yeah, I do want to dive into that stakeholder management and really having to refine those questions. Before we do that, I want to jump over to Chris for a second, because I know you've done both public sector and then made that full transition. So I'm kind of curious on your end, what do you think are the kind of the biggest differences, whether it's in hard skills or stakeholders or something else? I don't know if you can speak to kind of like that contrast between I guess working at state and now working at McMaster. And obviously you've also had the academic experience. So a few things to pull from.
Yeah, I was just going to say that the only thing I would disagree with on what Jefferson just said is that there are agencies out there that are not cash strapped, but there aren't many of them. And they're mostly the DoD and the intelligence community.
Yeah, that's fair.
They have more, in fact, probably they have more than they need. In fact, so much so that they don't often know what to do with all of it. Other than those examples, I would agree with that.
All those good government contracts.
Yeah.
Company maker.
Yeah. So the difference is, I actually am glad I read this question ahead of time, because I wouldn't say that the kind of the profit signal aside, which of course you're often going to be chasing in the private sector, if not directly, then tangentially. I actually really think it's less of a distinction between. I think the distinction is less government versus private sector, and more, in my opinion, the size of the organization and the age of the organization. Where I was before at state, obviously a very old organization, a very large organization, but I was in a very kind of cordoned off area, so we could do the particular type of work that we needed to do. And it was a smaller and more agile group than you get in a lot of like larger private sector companies like Goldman Sachs or something like that, where being agile and responsive to different emergent demands in the data science world and the analytics world is just as difficult as it is if you're working for the State Department or the Commerce Department. So I don't know. I think my company right now is kind of in between. It's not huge. It's large, but not huge. But it is a very old company. And so in general, I think we're a lot more flexible and agile than my time in the government for the most part, with some exceptions, some actually interesting exceptions. But yeah, I think it's more complex than just, are you in the private sector? Are you in the public sector? And, how is that going to affect how you're going to be operating?
Yeah, no, it's definitely, I mean, we papered over, like, if you're in, I put like nonprofit, right? Everyone, if you can list as a 501c3, you'll do it, because you'll save money, right? But all those think tanks, like, I mean, when I was in DC, if you went to like the Carnegie Institute or Brookings or whatever, I mean, we used to go to those places based on how good their free lunch was.
Yeah,
grad student life, right? And free lunch is pretty good. Like, it's like, catering costs, like, it's expensive.
Actually, I was going to add one more thing. Another really important distinction is whether you're working for if in the private sector, is if your company is fully private or publicly traded. That has a huge impact on often the creativity of the work you can do, in my opinion, and the in a lot of cases the extent to which you can do more research and development. There's more patience for that often in private companies, at least from what I've seen. And so I think there's a little bit more appetite for experimentation, like you might see. Like, I'm in the government, one of the cool things is that so often a lot of when we were working with third parties, they were really excited to work with us because, we were definitely tackling problems that they'd never tackled before. And so they felt that if they worked with us, they could learn a lot more about improving their own platform. And that was always exciting and also helpful, because other than that, the procurement process and getting those deals together was always such a nightmare. So they can maybe help us a little bit more by being excited to work with us. But so I think that is certainly true to a large extent, that the problems you deal with in the public sector certainly cause you to change your approach and your tech stack accordingly. And sometimes in really interesting ways that you can, once you kind of figure it out, you can actually kind of reinvest or reapply in a private sector context.
Talk to me about the tech stack difference. I'm sure it obviously differs by org and like maturity, from like a data perspective. But is there like in general, like, my understanding was always like, if you're in academia, you end up being an R person. If you want to go work at a startup, you do Python. It's super simplistic, but like, what other kind of like either differences, or am I totally wrong? That's okay too.
Well, yeah, again, it's really not that simplistic, but I will say, I mean, in general, you're going to certainly see more Windows environments in the government.
Well, yeah, I wasn't even thinking about, I was thinking more along the lines of like coding languages, data viz tools.
Yeah. Well, but that affects that. So, but that being said, what's funny is that my shop at the State Department was all Unix based and all Python based, and not a lot of low level programming. In my current shop has a lot more C# and Microsoft .NET frameworks, but also a good amount of Unix and Python as well. So I think a big thing that you see in the government, although it's starting to change a little bit. I'm going to speak about the federal government here, though. Again, so there's a big enough difference between federal and local, but there was obviously a huge emphasis early on in the government of having everything on premise.
On-prem versus cloud,
yeah, and that's changing pretty significantly, mostly because the big cloud providers are really getting skillful at working with the government, and also are not only from a contracting vehicle perspective, but also just understanding all the security compliance required, and having basically just separate walled off government practices. But that being said, my company is also an older company, and we have a lot of stuff on premise, and it's an investment that they've decided to make up front, and it kind of works for us in a lot of ways. not going to be.
Yeah, no, there's not a rhyme or reason. What's always hilarious is when companies choose to move from on-prem to cloud-based stuff, they forget about the CapEx versus OpEx conversation. And so it's like, oh, I remember, let's throw Morningstar into the bus. I went to a talk at Morningstar, and whoever it was talking about when they first, like some of the learnings they did from early transitions to cloud stuff. And they're like, someone didn't click the button and left it on over the weekend. And that was like a $15,000 weekend for no reason. And, or he's like, we had to go back and tell our CFO, like, why this thing that was supposed to be cheaper and now cost us 3 times as much.
Yeah, usually if you're a good client, they'll cut you a break if you're like a good customer.
Oh yeah, I mean, obviously at that scale they will, but I'm sure they sent someone to go and negotiate. I'm sure that's not what they ended up paying, but it's a good example of like not understanding the dynamics of like, if you pay for this stuff up front, your fixed costs at that point are just the person to maintain it, and then the only problems you have is when someone kicks the plug out or something, and then the internet crashes. But aside from that.
Yeah, so really where my experience is at this point is very minimal is working in a really new organization, because whether it's in the government or the private sector or actually even a nonprofit, my first thing I did, I've been in mostly established organizations, so I have a little blind spot in terms of like the startup community.
No, we all do, or we all have blind spots rather. Mine is less the startup community; it's more all of this stuff in between, but. That's why we're here to learn. Just an FYI, so there's some sort of syncing problem with LinkedIn. So we're only live on YouTube. Still recording it, so it'll go back out, and we'll like share it, kick it out to everyone on the email list and stuff. But we're just gonna use the time, have a conversation. If someone on YouTube manages to throw a question our way, awesome. Obviously, I'll cut this part out when we put it out there. But yeah, so as long as you guys want to go, I'm happy to keep chatting. But one question I wanted to dive into is, how do we talk about? I think it's more the kind of the stakeholder management, and like you guys I forgot who brought up the point about your questions are very different. Sometimes they're a lot broader. How do you focus those to become data questions? Because I know in broader, business stuff, right? One of the biggest pain points that I hear about, especially on these kinds of talks, is people will throw out things like, "Oh, we want to make more money. Let's use our data to like do something," but it's not like a data-driven question in the sense of, "Oh, we wanted to do this. Here's the KPI. Here's how we get there." Usually, the folks, all the directors I'll talk to, they'll say things like, "Yeah, my stakeholder came to me, asked for this, and I have to tell them that that's not how data works." I'm a little more blunt than they usually are, but that's the question. Is that something you guys run into? Is that often a challenge from like a stakeholder perspective, or do you find that's actually less of a problem when there's something else?
So I can speak from my side. Yeah. I think I have stakeholders that go between two extremes. Mm-hmm. Either they think that data can solve all their problems, or they think that data can solve none of their problems. And I feel like there's no gray area with people that I interact with, and that's okay, right? Like, that's our job as data scientists, is to find that middle ground for people and say, well, data might not be able to solve all of your problems, but here's what we can understand from data that we can give you. And then to the person who says, well, data can't solve any of my problems or very few of my problems, we have to sort of broaden them out and show them where, and as I said earlier, like we have to connect. Sometimes the data scientist role in a public organization, we get to do like the actual data science and creating the models and running the statistics and finding things, but oftentimes our job is a lot of connecting the dots for people. And that is especially true if we're dealing with external stakeholders, because, if you think about like people in my community, there are a lot of folks that are in my community that are data literate, but that's not the majority. Mm-hmm. And so when we start creating analytical or information products that we desire our community to leverage, and we saw this a lot with the pandemic. I mean, our community is still clamoring for data around, cases and deaths and those sorts of things. But we have to help them to understand what that data means, how to use it, and how to interpret it. And so I think that's a big piece of stakeholder, at least that I have experienced, is a big piece of stakeholder management in the public sector.
Yeah, I was gonna have those pain points. Go for it.
Yeah, and I'd dovetail to that. I kind of find that similar dynamic. There's the technical futurists who are very much, it's like, yeah, data can, we can datify this, data that, measure all this, and then there's the people on the other end is that they're just very skeptical of the technology or the potential, or hesitant, and there's kind of risk issues. I will say that in terms of stakeholder management, that we're looking kind of broadly in terms of governance, because particularly in public agencies, we have a lot of outward constituencies that interact with us. And one of our approaches in the program is not just data, but it's information. It's more broadly in managing information. So, we teach students about, principles underlying Freedom of Information Act requests and data availability and integrating data storytelling and bring these into governance processes and whatnot. So I think in some respects that maybe even gets back to one of those one of the questions we had a little bit earlier about, like, what do you find is like one of these kind of differences between public and private analytics, is that being able to manage the institutional politics, being able to create useful data products that are going to be ripped apart by external communities and external actors, and sometimes can be repurposed against the entities that are making the information available. So there's a bit of political nuance into it.
And Stephen, just to that, I think you made a really good point that, we don't, when my team talks about the products that we put out, we don't say that we're doing data or analytical products, because that doesn't quite encompass what we're trying to get to. We have very much institutionalized the word that we are creating information products, because that's what we want to do, right? We don't just want to put data out there, because data, while it's great, right? That's the worst thing you can do, is just put data out and let people have at it, right? Like, I'm a very big believer in government transparency. I think that as a government entity, that's what we are responsible to our stakeholders, to our community. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we're just releasing data out so that they can just do whatever they want with it. Which is why, like, I'm very insistent on the fact that we are creating information products. Because I think that the word, and as Stephen, as you brought up, that terminology is incredibly important, because it denotes this idea of storytelling, connecting those dots, all those different things.
Yeah, there's like that big education piece, and I love that you mentioned that that data literacy piece, right? Where if you throw something out, people are going to look at it and be like, well, they don't know what to look for, right? Some people don't understand outliers. It's like in business, I want the outlier. I want the one who's the 0.1% who's spending $90,000 a year on Facebook game toys. Like, I want that. I don't want to sell to that person, right? But it's like, if you don't know what you're looking for, data is less helpful.
Yeah, and I'll say, like, just the general level of data literacy and technical competence in many public agencies is not very high, and that gives, and I believe it was Jefferson who said this earlier. It's like you get a lot of deference in tech, particularly in government, in ways that you don't in other areas, because you have a substantive kind of specialist area of knowledge that a lot of people don't have kind of a certain forms of recognizance about. But that ethics is something that was absolutely mandated, that when we created the program, is that there's a lot of potential to use you making data available. Like, everybody says, well, let's make all data open. It's like, no, there's certain types of data that, like,
no one should know that.
you got like FERPA, and you got HIPAA, you've got all sorts of laws that protect certain types of data that are being privatized, but it can also act as a liability to many public agencies, because it can be repurposed, it can be reused, it can be weaponized against the agency, and it can create legal liabilities and whatnot. So teaching the ethical thinking and reasoning, and incorporating that into a general strategy, I think is part of the nuance of public analytics.
Yeah,
and I remember this from my government days. It's at least less of an issue now, but and I think what I'm doing is a little bit more ML for. I mean, it's for. I'm working mostly in like the search search engineering, search modeling world. So it's a bit more functional than like analytical reporting communications. It's a kind of a hard engineering problem, but I was very much doing more like the consultative analytics work previously in the government space. You certainly it can be very gratifying because a lot of people really do, especially in agencies where they haven't had a lot of insights before, can be very appreciative. But in cases where your reporting doesn't quite answer all the questions that they hoped that it would, or maybe doesn't conform with what their a priori assumptions were, it's very difficult but important to kind of before you release out information to I guess just be very, very clear about like what the conclusions they can draw from this, because oftentimes in cases where maybe we didn't do as good of a job of that, I think the rumor mill was more likely to start as to like whether the products that we were putting out were really of the quality or the standard that they hoped. And in a large organization with like lots of stakeholders, many of whom have less data literacy, that can be like really dangerous and very difficult to quell.
Yeah, no, that's like, I mean, I think you get that with anyone who's trying to like, I mean, I've seen similar feedback from folks who are like, especially going in like an older kind of organization, standing up the first data org, and like most of what their work ends up being is just a bunch of random people ask for a bunch of random stuff, and they end up with like, 100 different dashboards that someone looked at once and no one looks at ever again, a bunch of shelfware, versus like, and then so because I always ask like, what did you do wrong? What can we not learn from? And so that's always a common example. And they're like, in my next place, I told everyone, here's what we can do, here's what we can't do. These are like the 5 dashboards that we're making. If you want something hyper particular for you, unless you're the C-suite, not going to happen without something very specific. So like, I don't know if you guys have to go through that effort of saying, okay, well, we can do that, but like, who is the target audience? What's the business problem, or whatever? Not business problem, but what's the problem we're looking to solve? And kind of like going through that process. What about for someone who is you might be a policy analyst, or you might work for a big state org or whatever. What's the kind of like, not lowest hanging fruit, but people often say like, I want to become more data driven. That could mean going down and getting hardcore data science skills, but it could also just mean more high level data literacy. What do you think is like that? I don't want to say best thing for someone who's like thinking about this to start dip their toes into or to learn. Or if there's like a mindset or a framework, or what would you recommend for folks who are thinking, hey, I want to start becoming more data driven? What are like the things that they should be learning?
Yeah, I guess this probably comes to me first, being in the educational realm.
There's options, right? Obviously, they could do.
Yeah. Well, I was trying, like, for us is that like when I speak to students who are coming into the program, they say like, what can I do to prepare before the fall semester? And I say like start learning R, and like learning those coding and statistical environments. For us is R is a big part of it. Yeah, like gosh, there's so much like for us, like statistics. And there was something I was surprised on. I remember seeing a Twitter like from somebody kind of higher up, data science type, saying like, I went through my whole program without taking a statistics course in like data science, and I'm like, really?
That kills my heart. That like breaks my heart a little bit inside.
Yeah, like I don't know if it was a very computer science and it was like maybe more oriented towards something, but like to me, I just didn't understand that perspective, because like we send all our students go through our first course in our doctoral research method sequence and already have exposure to statistics. There's a lot of people who get through even graduate programs taking research methods that don't really understand it, and we really like it says like Yeah, if you're going to be using these tools, especially for inferential modeling, like you need to be conversant on the assumptions of the processes. You need to know how they work to a much higher degree than you would you would get in a lot of different graduate programs. Yeah, I'll hand it over. I think there's some other people who are wanting to chime in.
So there are two things. So I think for me, when you asked that question, like my mind immediately went to like my stakeholders and what I want them to learn as somebody's like building a data org, what is it that you need to educate people on? But I'll stick with what Steven started out with of like those people who are looking to get into data in the public sector and like what are the things that what is that those basic level foundations. So like when I bring a new analyst on, there are two books that I make them read. One is How to Lie with Statistics, and that's a book by Daryl Hoff. It was a book that it was required reading in my grad program. It is an exceptional book, and it teaches you a lot about like how people present statistics and lie with them, and how you can do that too. There's also a book about how to lie with maps. That's a great book. I also highly recommend that. Being the geospatial nerd that I am, I find great joy in that. But those are like key core foundational concepts of like, you got to know how people are going to use your information to potentially they're going to mistranslate your information. And if you have that understanding of how that might happen, you can oftentimes prevent it. And that's from basic level, I'm putting out a report, all the way up to I'm developing a machine learning model and I'm doing something with it, like all the way in between. So that's book one. And then the second one that I always have people read is a book called Weapons of Math Destruction. And that is an amazing book. It goes back to the ethic ideas. That is by a professor out of Harvard, Kathy O'Neill. And just again, a phenomenal book. It really talks about how people can use the mathematics and statistics that we're going to put out in negative ways, and how it's already being used in negative ways, and really talk about the ethics behind data science, in particular in how data science gets applied to humans. And that's basically what we do in the public sector, is we apply analytics and data science to humans. So those for me are the two foundations: understanding how people are going to use your data incorrectly, and understanding the ethics behind what we do.
I love that. Yeah, when it comes to numbers, I always love when people start putting them out like as like stats, because then I'm like, oh, I'm always just looking for the asterisk, and I'm like, okay, and I get this by this definition. Go for it.
Yeah, so I have another thought. Like, particularly in the public sector, you'll find that methods, when we're looking at data creation, there's a lot of context in the private sector where you're looking at a very discrete, easily constructed type thing, like a transaction record or a particular quantity or something like that. But one of the big difficulties for people in coming to the public sector, and I mentioned this at the very beginning, was like that you're dealing with socially constructed phenomenon, and because we're preparing students, our students are going to be, city information officers, chief data officers, policy analysts, and all that whatnot. Is that one thing I push students towards, and many have taken up on it, is taking classes in survey research, survey design, because they're going to be data creators. That a lot of time people are in contexts where they're using secondary data, they're using other people's stuff and just running the analysis. But when you're dealing with social phenomenon, you need to design a survey, because and a viable survey that doesn't ask double-loaded questions where people can't self-identify into multiple responses. And I've just seen, even from fairly complex and well-defined organizations, like bad instrument collection designs. To me, understanding data skills has to go into data creation and the theory of measurement and classification and understanding the phenomenon beyond just simply recanting and using somebody else's stuff. So that's a very difficult thing to do.
I love that, actually. For folks who watch this recording, they should check out on the same YouTube channel Claudia Naticia's talk specifically on that. Hers was UX research, but still, like, how to create a survey, how to create the service that gets the information that you're actually looking for, and you don't bias the information with the questions and all that kind of fun stuff. Of course, hers was also just beautiful because she made a really pretty deck. But not all of us are designers by trade, so.
Yeah. What do you think? You think of the public sector? There's census data. A census is a survey. Voting is a survey. Human resources, performance measurement, citizen satisfaction, community engagement. All these things are survey driven, and I think it's an often overlooked aspect of this kind of data.
Or when you do it wrong, right? Like, when you have, like, people like to use my cat's complaining, NPS scores, right? You'll see a tail probably come up on the screen at some point in the very near future. But when I see it oftentimes, like, NPS scores misused, right? Someone will say, "Oh, well, how would you rate us?" And they'll say, "Oh, it's like a 7." And someone thinks, "Oh, it's good," and then it's like, "Oh, that actually is terrible." It doesn't help anyone, right? And people don't understand how it's used, and, like, you don't properly, like, sandbox that information, right? They just kind of throw it out there. I'm not sure I cut you off, Chris. Was there something you wanted to add now?
I mean, I wish I had taken it. The survey thing resonates with me because it's oft overlooked in a lot of toolboxes, and part of the reason I think is because it's often the work of very specialized people, which is fine in organizations. So there's, like, sociologists or people who are actually, like, methodologists, but it's still useful, and it's still great to be able to at least understand some of the methodologies. I know in my government team, we had 2 PhD social scientists who designed a lot of surveys, but some of the other analysts really got to learn a lot about it and help them out and kind of start to grow in that direction. But I guess the only thing I was going to say in terms of this is kind of a cop-out question in terms of what I think are useful skills to gain is, again, cop-out question, but I really think you should kind of start with what you're interested in.
It's not it's kind of a cop-out answer, but it's like the same thing as, like, when someone says it depends. It always depends.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's obvious answers, but I think if you're curious enough, one thing really always leads to the next.
You have to have that, otherwise it's not going to work, right? It's for everything is you have to. It's even, like, we see that a lot with like, a very common question that gets asked is, like, okay, well, for people who are coming out of some sort of coding boot camp or data science boot camp, the obvious question is, like, how do you prove that you can do something in professional sense without having had that job? And it's like, well, what projects should we do, right? And usually these people are out copying projects they find on Kaggle or whatever, and it's like that's not gonna be as good as if there is something you, like, love. And you created a question, you found some random data, I don't care what it is, it doesn't have to be huge, right? You kind of want to the model, the workflow, and if you love that, like, it shows, because then you can talk about it, right? And that is, at the end of the day, like, I think a few of you pointed out that's like one of the hardest things and most important things to be able to do.
Yeah, I see a question in the prompt there from Bridget.
Oh, excellent. Bridget, she works on the role of vaccination data entry for health department. Is it a form of survey data? Great question. Does anyone want to address that?
I guess as the health department official, I can probably answer that potentially. So it depends. This is going to be another cop-out answer. It depends on what data is getting collected in that, right? Like, if we're just saying name, date, name when they got their vaccine and which dose, like how many doses they got and what the brand was, to me, that's not survey data. That's data entry, data collection. That's not really design survey. If, however, we're talking about, you're calling somebody and you're talking to them, you ask the question of, are you vaccinated? And they say no. And then you're trying to get at like why they're not getting vaccinated. That is definitely survey data. And the design of that, and I think what it gets to, and I think what Stephen and Chris's point is that like the design of how we collect those two sets of data are very different. And the people who collect those data can oftentimes be incredibly different, because a person who can just put data into sort of these, the structured data fields, that takes one set of skills. Whereas somebody who's asking survey questions, if it's not like a self-driven survey, that takes a whole nother set of skills, because you could, in theory, bias your sample if you're delivering your questions in a certain way and you're not really paying attention to how you're communicating and those sorts of things.
Yeah, and that goes back to like I say a business question. You guys might call it a different thing, but like at the end of the day, it's like, are we trying to figure out how to make how to enhance access to COVID vaccinations? So the questions might be something along the lines of, how far did you have to travel to get here today? How many modes of transportation did you have to use? Was it like a 2 trains and a bus situation? Right? How far is it from your home? That kind of question, or like whatever. Like that's kind of like one thing, but obviously like that's I think where you start to get really useful information.
Yeah. How many people are in your household? How many people have had their second shot or had their booster?
Yeah.
Does your work environment require you to be vaccinated? If you're not vaccinated, do you have weekly testing and stuff like that? So there's nuance in that, because we have this problem in survey research of iterator reliability, where just sometimes people reading the same questions using similar terminology or going off script a little bit will kind of pollute the data and start coding things differently than somebody else would code them. But you also have this problem of people who are reactive. We've seen this politicization of vaccination, that people might intentionally misreport. It's like, I've been vaccinated, because they just don't want to deal with it, or they don't want to end up on some government list or something like that. So we're dealing with people who are reactive, and that's another big distinction in the methodologies.
Those of us who just answer C and move on,
or the D, all of the above, and just like pass it to the next. Yes, I have all of those.
All the above answers, I'm always like, it's like not worth even having. I'd rather make them pick something, but that has its own problems, right? Because then you just pick something at random because you don't want to deal with it. That's something else. Bridget, I had a follow up, and so for the county that she works for, they want to replace people's cards in case they get lost or destroyed. Blah blah blah. Also, in case people's underlying conditions or medical interact somehow with a dose. Lots of brands. I see. So it's just trying to understand, who is getting the shot, and I suppose making sure that they don't get bad side effects.
Yeah. So I think like the work, Bridget, that you're doing is what Stephen defined as more of that operational data gathering, and then the analytics that would come behind that based on that data. Honestly, that is a lot of bread and butter of what we do as a health department in these scenarios. Is we're less focused. It's not we're less focused. We have a dual focus of driving an operation to get people to either do something, whether that's contact tracing or vaccination, and trying to analyze that data to make it better, and trying to get more people to get vaccinated and that sort of thing. So the data that you're putting in, again, I probably wouldn't consider that to be survey data, but it doesn't make it any less important to the operation or any less important to understanding the problem at hand. I mean, I think that that's a big and important note, is that in the public sector, we don't really have the time to collect data for the sake of collecting data. Like, we have to collect data because we're going to want to use it at some point. And so any data that you're putting in is going to be useful at some point down the road. Otherwise, we wouldn't be collecting it.
That's fair. Where in the private sector, it's just after every interaction, how was your experience today? And someone eventually looks at it, but I mean, like when I design something, it's like every week, when we do a course, I want to know like every week, how was it? Why are you here? What did you learn? Was it too hard? Was it too easy? Is it boring? All those kinds of things. And it's like every week probably doesn't matter, right? I just want to see an aggregate. Is it the, if one person said it's bad, their fault. If everyone says it's bad, it's our fault.
Well, yeah, and I think every time one of my internal or if anyone ever comes and asks my team for data,
Mhm.
the first question out of our mouth is, how are you going to use it? What are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
Because if their answer is, well, I just want to collect it just because I want it, that's not worth the time and effort that it's going to take to get it. It's like, you got to have an idea of what you're going to do with this information as you're collecting it. And I think that, and you said it's a very interesting difference between the public sector and sort of the work that you do. I'm not going to blanketly say the private sector because that's probably too much of a generalization.
Yeah.
But this idea that we're not going to just collect data to sit there that we might eventually use.
Mm-hmm.
Mostly, at least for me, from my perspective, there's two reasons that I don't do that. One is all the information that comes into my department is FOIA-able. And I don't want information in my information store that I'm going to have to then release at some point and say, yeah, we just collected it for the heck of it. We wasted tax dollars collecting this information just to have it, right?
Yeah.
And then the second reason is and this is really the crux for me, is we have to build trust with our community. And if we're just collecting information and storing it, there always becomes this question of, well, what you got to be using it for something. So what are you using it for?
Yeah,
we try to be very careful about what information we collect in order to continue to build that trust with our community.
Yeah. No, one thing I will say that I think you pointed out, I think this is maybe the last statement, at least that I have, and if anyone else has anything to conclude, more than welcome to chime in. But I think the biggest thing that I think data at large, public, private, NGO, I don't care. Like the thing that you pointed out that I love is why. What do you want? Why are you collecting this data? Why are you using it? One talk that we're lining up for January is a talk about why data projects fail. And so often it's someone asks a question that is either not a real question, not something you can do data for, it's not specific enough, or it's not what have you, or there's just no thought process. It's like, because I just want to know. And I'm like, well, that, you waste a lot of compute for that. It's like, you waste a lot of time for that.
Yeah.
But that's the biggest pain point that I see is just understanding the why. Because if you know the why, you could find something, right? Where I've talked to companies that will say, we don't have any ROI on our data spend. And then I learned that they're just reporting stuff to report it without any sort of question. I'm like, well, how can you find an answer if you don't have a question?
Yeah, I did want to kind of chip in into saying that one thing that I incorporated by design into the MSCA program was kind of this idea of understanding that being in the public sector, particularly in the roles for the students that we're creating, means that you also have to act in a regulatory capacity towards the private sector. So how are data technologies being used by the private sector? It's if you're going to have, the city is going to have a ride share assessment on Ubers that originate in and out of the loop or something like that. It's how is that collected? How is it figured? How is that stuff there? But yeah, that for us, managing information and managing data and data usage is important internally to the organization and our governance processes, but there's an expectation that we are going to be also overseeing policy that is going to be monitoring and being used for enforcement actions by entities in the private sector, where those digital technologies interface with the public and have certain consequences. So that's a perspective we put in, is that we're not just analysts, we're not just technical users, that we're information managers, but we're also policy wonks to an extent. So.
Well, and that's, I actually love that. And I know I said it was the last thing, but what you said really struck a nerve with me, because I vividly remember, I'm not going to say which state regulatory agency I was dealing with, but back in my coding bootcamp days, to become a licensed post-secondary education institution, you have to submit a giant application, and an analyst looks at it and gives you the yay or nay. In our case, it got sent back because they asked us for our library, and we had sent a GitHub repo of everything that we teach, and they said, that's not a library. It's like, it's a very large library of information that, should you look at it, you'll see that it gives you a lot of stuff. And so it's stuff like that, right? Where it's like, when you're in that capacity, it's super important to kind of have your finger on the pulse. But I'm not going to take up any more of everyone's time. Really appreciate everyone coming in. We're at home, but joining, really engaging conversation, some good questions. So with that, I'm going to jump off. But thanks everyone for attending, and obviously then this will go out to everyone who registered, and we'll post on LinkedIn and what have you. So I'm always able to come back and check it out and ask more questions, and everyone can obviously reach out to you guys on LinkedIn if they are curious or want to learn more or what have you. So with that, thank you very much. Like us on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, everywhere, and I'll see everyone next time.